All right, welcome to the channel. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. A lot of times on this channel, I like to read works of classic Christian literature. And today I'm going to be doing maybe a little bit of commentary on a piece of literature that people have requested that I review and discuss. And this is volume one of Abraham Kuyper's Common Grace. This is chapter one, and this over here on the this side of my screen here that I've got on the screen record. This is actually, if you go to Neo-Calvinism.org and you look at their resources and go to their bibliography for Abraham Kuyper, you can actually find the Common Grace works there in Dutch, and you can use an AI translator. You can use ChatGPT translation, and it gives you a translation. I've compared this with the Lexham Press version, and I have to say the Lexham Press translation is far better. You get the footnotes, you get the hard copy book, but I guess this is better than nothing. If you want to read Kuyper and you want to learn Dutch, you could do that. If you want to get somewhat of a mechanical translation, you can see that here. But today I do want to just introduce Abraham Kuyper's work on Common Grace and get into chapter one in his introduction here. You can see he starts off with 1 Peter 3:20, the first part of that, when the long-suffering God once waited in the days of Noah. And so really here from page 1 to around 110 of Kuyper's volume 1 on Common Grace, he's going to deal with the Noahic covenant and really establish from the Noahic covenant this doctrine of common grace. And when you read Kuyper, one of the things I like about reading him so much is that he writes in this architectonic way in which he lays foundations that you're kind of wondering where he's going with something, but then it only later becomes fully visible what he's trying to do. And that's certainly what he's doing here in the introduction. Why start this book starting, talking about Noah, and then what does this have to do with common grace? But in this episode or this video, I want to talk about, I want us to think about this question. Why did Kuyper think that Reformed theology needed a doctrine of common grace in order to make sense of ordinary human life? And to answer that, I think it's necessary to posit another question. If humanity is radically fallen, why does the world still contain beauty, justice, art, family loyalty, civic order, scientific discovery, and even examples of remarkable virtue among unbelievers? So these are the types of questions I think that all believers should wrestle with at some point in their lives and kind of come up with a satisfactory answer, and I believe Kuyper does so here in his work on common grace. Here's some other questions to kind of think about. Why doesn't human history simply collapse into hell immediately? I mean, you think about Adam and Eve when they fell. Why did they not just immediately drop into the lake of fire and that be the end of humanity as we know it? Why does every time someone sins, they don't immediately go to judgment? Why is their life prolonged as an unbeliever? And ultimately, unbelievers are allowed to live until very old age at times, and they accomplish some great things, humanly speaking. So Kuyper begins his discussion with these questions in mind, and Kuyper, will kind of argue that before we can talk about redemption, we have to really explain why there is still a world left to redeem. And so the chapter 1 introduction here, Kuyper's going to start off, and he's going to talk about here his magazine, De Herat, and talk about, when this appeared in 1878, talking about the Calvinistic Confession of the Fathers. He's basically talking about how, in these first few paragraphs, how that particular grace is emphasized throughout De Herat. And this is this weekly magazine. Kuyper, you have to remember, wrote a 4-volume commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. He was not opposed to particular grace. He's not a universalist. He's a Calvinist in everything that term encompasses. But there's some necessary background for particular grace, and he gets into that talking about covenant, and he talks about being part of a community, a member of a body, a participant in a circle. And the necessary background for particular grace is covenant. And then he goes on to explain that the necessary background for covenant is common grace. What is particular grace? What is common grace? We've talked about these things, and I've mentioned some of these terms. I need to explain those a little bit more. Well, particular grace is election of individuals to be saved. Therefore, that's the term particular. Common grace, as we're going to see here in a little bit, is common. It applies to all men without distinction. This is not to be confused with prevenient grace and like the Armenian system. It's not a grace unto salvation. Common grace is simply a restraining of sin and wickedness, and we'll see that as we go on. But he does talk about this need for covenant and this need for common grace. And as you read Kuyper's article here, he talks about Christians being more than isolated individuals limited to themselves. Christians are part of a covenant community. Christians are members of a community. They're part of a body. They participate in a group identity. And this is enclosed within an organism. And, we can talk about that being covenant. This is covenant community. If you talk about election and abstract that away from covenant, election without a covenant community, this can really lead to lack of assurance of faith. This can lead to attempts to take hold of the Spirit without the Son. That's a powerful thought, and we'll maybe come back to that in the future, taking hold of the Spirit without the Son. And personal election really only appears in the context of the covenant of grace. There are individual souls, but those individual souls must experience being incorporated into the community of the saints. And we also are part of a common humanity. You think about a common humanity, the human race. Neither does election nor belonging to the covenant community does that negate our common humanity. So those, in other words, who are elect, those who are part of the covenant community, those who are part of the church body, that does not negate the fact that you are a human. Because you become part of the church, because your election calling is made sure, right, that doesn't mean that you are no longer a human. You still have that common humanity in common with unbelievers. It does not remove our participation in the life of the family. Just because you became a Christian and now you go to church doesn't mean you cease being a father. Doesn't mean you cease having a job. You still have to be a mother to your children or whatever your calling is in life. You still have that participation in the life of the family, the homeland, the world, etc. And so Kuyper discusses three emanations of God's grace. Particular grace, this applies to you personally. Covenantal grace, which is basically what you would have in common with all of the saints. Common grace is what you have in common with all people as a human being. And all of these are the fruit of sovereign grace. And these series of articles that Kuyper's writing really deals with that third element of common grace. And when you think about the spheres of grace that Kuyper delineates there, particular grace, covenant grace, and common grace, it really, these spheres of grace serve to answer three different questions. Particular grace serves to answer the question, why am I saved? Well, because if you look back in God's eternal counsel, He has foreordained you to be saved, right? You can go to many passages, Acts 13:48, as many as were ordained to eternal life believed, right? And there are many others about that. So particular grace answers the question, why am I saved? Covenant grace answers this question, what does it mean to belong to the people of God? And common grace serves to answer this question, why does human civilization continue at all? So you have the question of salvation, individual salvation, covenant participation, belonging to the people of God, and then finally, why does human civilization continue at all? And that's really where this common grace assertion comes into play. So Kuyper refuses to reduce Christianity to isolated individuals, but he also refuses to dissolve individuals into the collective. Really, there's a both and here. It's not an either or. Kuyper also in this first article here, this introductory chapter, he worries that if Christians think only in terms of isolated individuals and personal religious experiences, they may lose sight of how God ordinarily gathers and nurtures His people through a historical community. And that's so important. People accuse Kuyper of all sorts of things. One of the things that people accuse Kuyper of is that his whole, kind of this worldly, they call it this worldly system rather than otherworldly kind of Christianity. They accuse Kuyper of really diminishing the importance of the visible church. We'll talk a little bit later about Kuyper's doctrine of the church there. But if people say Kuyperians don't think that the institutional church, is important, they only care about the church as organism, and that's really kind of the way Kuyper talks about the church. But Kuyper doesn't, that's kind of an unfair reading of him. He doesn't think that you should neglect the institutional church. And he does stress the importance that, God ordinarily gathers and nurtures his people through a historical community. It's not just a bunch of Christians as isolated individuals doing their own good deeds and things in the world to accomplish God's purposes. It is the covenant community. And Kuyper fears a kind of hyper-individual spirituality which would be detached from the concrete means that God uses in history. And these could be family, church, covenant community, sacrament, and embodied life together. So there is the individual being important, there is the community being important, and it's a both and, it's not an either or. When Kuyper then gets into the discussion of the meaning of common grace, he's clear to assert that this is not saving grace. It's not particular, it's not saving, it is common grace. So it's not saving, and it applies to all people. And he seems to indicate that it is neglected in Reformed teaching, although the seeds of it are there. Clearly in Calvin and others, they had worked out some of its main features, but they did not devote any single or sustained attention to it. There weren't any, major common grace works prior to Kuyper. I mean, he's got 3 volumes on it. He really wanted to kind of, make his mark here because it was neglected in his mind in Reformed theology. It was developed to some degree and affirmed, but not outright treated in the systematic fashion that he felt it needed treatment. He also thinks that common grace magnifies God's forbearance, but it does not exhaust it. I thought that was an interesting thing to kind of highlight. And common grace is seen in the fact that God's holiness and wrath against sin are not absolutely worked out. I want you to think about what that means, that God's holiness and wrath against sin are not absolutely worked out now. They will be eventually, but they're not worked out now. So history progresses, and there is a humankind. If God's holiness and wrath against sin were absolutely worked out now, everything would be obliterated, right? Because there's a ton of sin in this world. Immediately after the fall, God could have destroyed everything, right? He would have been just in doing so. But in his common grace, he's allowed there to be a history of mankind, a civilization, a society of men who progress throughout history. And not all those men are believers, right? I mean, he's allowed unbelievers to exist and to do great things, relatively speaking. So the common grace highlights, why is it called grace in the first place? Well, it's because it's divine patience and forbearing temporarily with sin. So, some people, they don't like that phrase grace because they think grace can only be salvific. And they say, well, you should just talk about providence instead of common grace. But it is grace in the fact that it is divine patience and it is a temporary forbearing with sin. It's not exacting the justice and the judgment that is due to sin immediately. And, how can you see common grace work itself out? Well, look at the uprightness and the nobility among pagans. People who are not Christians oftentimes have upright characters and, raise a family and sacrifice their lives in war and do all kinds of noble things. And this common grace, it does not cleanse man's nature. That is special and particular grace. But rather, common grace serves to restrain man's nature. It bridles the perversity of nature that it might not break forth into action. So that's really what common grace is. It's not cleansing, but it is a restraining grace that bridles the perversity of nature. And it is, a God forbearing with sin for a season and allowing humankind to exist, right? Common grace. So common grace as opposed to particular grace. Common grace restrains sin. Particular grace removes guilt. Common grace preserves creation. Particular grace redeems sinners in that creation. Common grace delays judgment, while particular grace reconciles sinners to God. Common grace is really about society building, and particular grace is about building the church. When you think about outside of the church, there is so much that is beautiful, worthy of esteem, and, that could provoke us to jealousy, right? So there's all these different things in the world that are beautiful and lovely that come from unbelievers, and how are we to account for that? If total depravity is true, which it is, if there is an antithesis, which we'll speak about later, how is all this true? And he says really there are two wrong paths to take, and then there's the reformed position. It kind of has this outlined here in the last paragraph here on the screen. But there is the Anabaptist position, which is that ultimately they deny all good in the world and creation. This is kind of your withdrawal from society, and just completely remove yourself and don't engage the world, just to withdraw, because there's nothing good in the world and creation. The Arminian pathway is to say that humanity has not fallen so deeply. It's just to deny the fact that humans are really as bad as total depravity says they are, right? It's just humanity has not fallen so deeply. It's still has some good left in it, and this also would apply to the Roman Catholic system, as he'll go on to develop later as well. And the Reformed view is that the good and the beautiful and the true, these exist outside the church among unbelievers in the world because of the restraint of ruin that lurks within sin, right? God restrains that principle of sin from working itself out consistently. Unbelievers do not act totally consistently with their principles. And we'll see that antithesis also holds true for believers, and that believers do not always act 100% in line with their principles. So the antithesis cuts through all mankind. We don't act as sanctified as we should be, and the world doesn't act as bad as they should be based on our natures. But human nature does suffer from pervasive depravity. But that depravity is not allowed to be worked out to its end. It is restrained, it is bridled. And so that's Kuyper's ultimate position there, in contrast with both Anabaptists and Arminians. What Kuyper does call the Arminian position, it might also fit with like a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian view. This really kind of sees each person as their own individual atom, and thus really not as fallen and able to obtain salvation through their will, right? And thus, in reality, there are really, 3 or 4 wrong paths if you want to break it down in more detail. Kuyper's just kind of given an overview here. The Arminian path, if you want to say, well, Arminians teach technically prevenient grace. So ultimately, they don't deny the extent of the fall. They functionally might as well, though, because they say that God immediately gives all those ruined by the fall the prevenient grace to be able to respond positively to the gospel. So that really the Arminian position, I think Kuyper is justified here in his critique. So the Anabaptist tendency is that the world is essentially corrupt and must be rejected. The Arminian tendency is that human nature retains enough goodness in itself. And the Kuyperian and Reformed position is that the goodness that we see in the world persists because God restrains corruption, and that is common grace. Kuyper wants to answer the question, what does Christianity mean for our relationship to people who are not Christians? Kuyper's answer is not separation nor assimilation. Instead, he wants to maintain that a shared humanity remains real even after the fall because of God's common grace. And Kuyper's opening, conceptual space here for Christians to explain why unbelievers can still build civilizations, create beauty, love their children, discover truth, and contribute to society. Kuyper is not naively optimistic about man. He's completely adherent to total depravity, and in fact, if you think about it, common grace only makes sense against the background of total depravity. We'll probably discuss on a future episode that concept of antithesis. I've already hinted at it a little bit. But man is totally depraved. However, God restrains that depravity from working itself out fully, as we've already said. Common grace is that God restrains the full eruption of sin. And Kuyper will discuss in a future chapter how sin separates man from himself, man from the world, man from God, man from others, right? And some opponents of common grace, and sometimes those who are friendly to the concept, they immediately want to make common grace about politics, cultural transformation, some sort of Christian nationalism, worldview activism. But Kuyper starts much deeper here in his Common Grace project. He wants to talk about the metaphysics of history, the preservation of creation, the post-fall human existence, especially in Noah's day, and thereafter. The concept of divine patience and the possibility of civilization. So all these things, Kuyper's a much deeper thinker, and he cannot be reduced to a slogan. He cannot be reduced to a lot of these misconceptions that people have of him today. I think if I just had to summarize chapter 1 in one sentence, it would be this. Kuyper introduces his common grace work in defining common grace as the divine restraint by which God preserves fallen human life and history, making possible the continued existence of civilization, culture, and even the covenant community itself until the completion of redemption at the eschaton. Thanks for watching. Hope this was helpful. We'll do a chapter 2 review next time. Thanks.